Marcus Thompson inherited $2.5 billion on his 19th birthday, along with a responsibility he never wanted and couldn't understand. The fortune came with board meetings in glass towers downtown, quarterly reports that stretched across mahogany tables, and decisions that affected thousands of employees across 3 states. But the responsibility was simpler and infinitely more complex. His father, once the sharp-minded architect of a business empire, now sat in the sunroom of their Buckhead mansion, unable to remember his own son's name most mornings. The house on Peachtree Street had been their family's anchor for 23 years, purchased when Marcus was still learning to walk, and his father was building the company that would eventually span from Atlanta to Birmingham to Charlotte. Now it felt like a museum of better times, filled with photographs of family vacations to Tybee Island, dinner parties where his parents danced in the kitchen after the guests left, Little League trophies gathering dust on bookshelves that his father had built with his own hands during weekend projects that stretched across entire summers. In 72 hours, 3 certified caregivers had quit. Each one came with impressive credentials, years of experience, and professional confidence that crumbled within days of meeting James Thompson's particular brand of confused resistance. The man who had once negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with the patience of a chess master now became agitated when strangers rearranged his pill bottles or suggested he needed help buttoning his shirts. The agency was out of options, and the insurance company had given them 30 days to prove James could stay home safely, or he'd be moved to a memory care facility permanently. Marcus made a decision that Tuesday morning that would haunt him for weeks. Standing in the kitchen, where his father had taught him to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, where his mother had packed his lunches for 12 years of school, where Denise had quietly maintained the rhythm of their family life for a decade and a half, he told her she was fired. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, carrying the weight of his frustration and fear disguised as business necessity. Denise Rodriguez had been cleaning their house since Marcus was 4 years old, arriving each Tuesday and Friday morning in her reliable Honda Civic, carrying supplies in the same canvas tote bag that was now worn soft at the handles. She knew every corner of the house, every routine, every one of James's peculiar habits from before the Alzheimer's took hold like morning fog that never burned off. She knew he preferred his coffee in the blue mug with the chip on the handle, that he read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's sports section before the business pages, that he spent exactly 20 minutes each evening checking the locks on all the doors. But Marcus saw only what his 20-year-old mind could process through the lens of panic and privilege. She was the maid, not a medical professional. He needed someone with credentials, someone who understood dementia protocols and medication schedules, someone who could handle the $180,000 monthly care plan the insurance demanded. The number itself was staggering, more than most families earned in 3 years, but Marcus had grown up in a world where money solved problems, where the right professionals could fix anything that was broken. Denise packed her cleaning supplies that Tuesday morning, while James sat at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of oatmeal that had gone cold an hour ago. The morning light, filtering through the window, caught the silver in her hair that had been completely black when she'd first started working for them. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she'd always shown, folding the dish towels she'd been using to organize his medications, gathering the spray bottles and scrub brushes that had kept their house spotless through Marcus's childhood illnesses, teenage parties, and college visits home. James hadn't eaten a full meal in 4 days. The oatmeal sat congealing in the bowl, topped with brown sugar and cinnamon, exactly the way he'd liked it for 30 years. But he seemed to have forgotten what to do with the spoon in his right hand. His left hand trembled slightly, a new development that the doctors said was common at this stage of the disease. Marcus watched his father's confusion from the doorway, feeling his stomach clench with guilt and terror in equal measure. The first certified caregiver arrived that afternoon with impressive qualifications and a no-nonsense approach that reminded Marcus of the efficiency experts his father had sometimes hired to streamline company operations. Linda Patterson had worked with Alzheimer's patients for 12 years, carried certifications in dementia care from 3 different organizations, and came with stellar recommendations from families in Virginia Highland and Druid Hills. She wore scrubs the color of cotton candy, carried a leather bag filled with medical supplies, and spoke to James in the kind of loud, slow voice people used when they assumed age meant deafness. She lasted 18 hours. James had always been a gentleman, the kind of father who'd never raised his voice during Marcus's teenage rebellions, who'd patiently taught him to drive stick shift in their driveway during the summer before college. But confusion made him resistant to strangers touching him, moving his things, disrupting routines he couldn't articulate, but somehow still needed like oxygen. When Linda tried to help him shower using standard protocols she'd learned in clinical settings, approaching the task with professional detachment, he pushed her away and fell backward into the bathroom door. The sound of his body hitting the wooden door echoed through the house like a gunshot. Marcus found them both on the bathroom floor, his father crying in a way he'd never seen before, not the tears of physical pain, but something deeper and more devastating. Linda was already reaching for her phone to call the agency, her confidence shattered by the reality of trying to care for someone who experienced every moment of assistance as an invasion by strangers he couldn't trust or understand. Marcus stood in his father's bedroom that night, watching the man who'd taught him to change a tire, to tie a necktie, to shake hands with firm eye contact, now trying to put his pajamas on backward for the 3rd time. The house felt enormous and hollow, without Denise's quiet presence moving through the rooms, anticipating needs before they became problems, maintaining the invisible infrastructure of care that had made their lives possible. She'd somehow always known when his father needed his afternoon snack 15 minutes early, or when the evening news was too loud, or when he was getting agitated because the mail had been moved from its usual spot on the hall table. Marcus had never noticed these small accommodations until they disappeared, like noticing the hum of air conditioning only after it stops working. The house was the same size it had always been, but it felt different now, full of spaces where competence used to live. His father's pajama shirt was inside out and backward, but James seemed satisfied with his effort, settling into bed with the simple contentment of a task completed, unaware that nothing about his appearance made sense to anyone else. The second caregiver, Patricia Williams, arrived Wednesday with a different strategy and 23 years of experience in geriatric nursing. She followed medical protocols to the letter, administered medications precisely on schedule, kept detailed charts that would have impressed the insurance company, and maintained professional boundaries that kept her interactions with James focused on measurable outcomes rather than emotional comfort. She treated his care like a series of problems to be solved, rather than a relationship to be maintained. James ate because she insisted, walked because she guided him, sat where she positioned him with the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to managing confused elderly patients. His daily routine became a series of medical tasks rather than the familiar rhythms that had once given his days meaning. But he stopped talking entirely. He'd been down to maybe 20 words a day, simple requests and occasional responses, but under Patricia's efficient care, he went completely silent, as if the effort of communicating through the fog of his confusion had become too exhausting to maintain. By Friday evening, he was standing at the living room window for hours, looking out at the garden where he'd once spent entire weekends planting tomatoes and pruning the azaleas that bloomed every spring in explosions of pink and white. His expression was one Marcus had never seen before, hollow and distant, like someone watching a movie of a life he used to recognize but could no longer access. It looked like grief, but deeper than sadness, more like someone mourning their own disappearance while still being forced to witness it. Patricia lasted 5 days before admitting the approach wasn't working, though she couldn't articulate exactly what was failing. She'd maintained his physical health perfectly, tracked every vital sign, documented every meal with the precision of a medical researcher, but something essential was fading from his eyes with each passing day. She recommended a more intensive medical facility, somewhere with staff trained to handle patients who were becoming increasingly withdrawn, who no longer responded to standard engagement techniques. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, a fear that went deeper than losing his father to a disease, and touched on losing him to a system that might keep his body alive while letting everything that made him James Thompson simply fade away. His father wasn't just forgetting things anymore, wasn't just struggling with names and dates and recent events. He was disappearing from inside his own life, becoming a stranger even to himself. The third caregiver never made it through her first weekend. Despite arriving with enthusiasm and specialized training in activity-based therapy for dementia patients. Margaret Chen was young, maybe 27, and had completed additional coursework in recreational therapy and cognitive stimulation. She arrived with puzzles designed for varying levels of mental acuity, games that promised to slow cognitive decline, music therapy equipment, and a structured schedule of activities meant to keep James engaged with the world around him. James took one look at her bright smile and cheerful voice and began calling her the thief. Not quietly, not once, but repeatedly, getting more agitated each time she approached with another therapeutic activity. He would point at her with shaking fingers and repeat the word with increasing distress, as if warning invisible family members about danger they couldn't see. Margaret tried every technique she'd learned, every method for redirecting paranoid ideation, but nothing worked. She packed her things Sunday morning, explaining that sometimes patients fixate on caregivers as threats, and once that association forms in a mind affected by dementia, it's nearly impossible to break. The brain's ability to form new positive associations becomes compromised, while fear and suspicion can become entrenched with devastating permanence. James stood at the window watching her load her car, his face showing relief for the first time in days. Marcus sat in his father's study that Sunday night, surrounded by photo albums he'd pulled from the shelves in a desperate attempt to understand what they'd lost and how to get it back. Pictures of James at company picnics, wearing the same blue polo shirt he'd favored for 15 years, teaching Marcus to fish at Lake Lanier during family vacations that had stretched across long summer weekends, building the garden that now grew wild outside the window, where autumn was turning the leaves gold and red. In every photo from the last 15 years, there was Denise in the background, not posing for the camera, but captured in moments of quiet service. Serving at dinner parties, wearing the black dress and white apron she kept for special occasions, helping decorate for Christmas with the patience of someone who understood that holiday traditions mattered more than efficiency. Standing beside James at Marcus's high school graduation because she'd insisted on taking pictures before the official photographer arrived. She wasn't just the maid in these photos. She was part of the fabric of their family life, so constant that Marcus had stopped seeing her the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. She'd been there when he'd broken his arm falling off his bike at age 7, bringing him ice cream while he sulked about missing Little League practice. She'd been there the morning after his mother's funeral, quietly preparing breakfast and maintaining routines when grief had made normal life seem impossible. Monday morning brought a call from the insurance company that made Marcus feel like the walls of his privileged world were closing in around him. They needed documentation that James could recognize family members, follow basic instructions, and maintain some level of daily routine, or the home care coverage would be terminated immediately. The assessment was scheduled for the following Monday, exactly 7 days, to prove his father could stay in the only home he had left. The house where he'd raised his family and built memories that were now fading like photographs left in sunlight. 7 days to demonstrate cognitive function in a man who'd forgotten how to button his shirts, who sometimes spent entire afternoons searching for his wife who'd been dead for 8 years, who looked at Marcus most mornings with the polite confusion reserved for helpful strangers. The weight of impossibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. His father barely recognized him on good days. The structured routines had disappeared weeks ago, replaced by confusion and resistance that grew worse each time a new caregiver tried to impose order on his dissolving world. Marcus called the agency again, but they'd officially classified the case as high risk after 3 professional failures in less than 2 weeks. No one else was willing to take on a patient who'd already proven resistant to standard care protocols. The phrase, high risk, appeared on forms and computer screens, reducing his father's complex humanity to a category that made him unmarketable to professional caregivers who needed success rates to maintain their reputations. Tuesday afternoon, Marcus came home from a meeting with the company's board of directors to find Denise's familiar Honda Civic in the driveway, parked in the same spot she'd used for 15 years, under the oak tree that provided shade during Atlanta's brutal summer afternoons. His first instinct was anger, the kind of sharp irritation that comes when someone ignores clearly stated boundaries. He'd made his decision clear. He'd handled her severance professionally with 2 weeks' pay and a reference letter, and now she was overstepping boundaries that had been established for everyone's protection. He walked into the kitchen, ready to remind her that she no longer worked here, that he was trying to manage a complex medical situation that required professional expertise. But the words died in his throat like candles blown out by an unexpected wind. His father was sitting at the table eating a peanut butter sandwich, using the blue plate with tiny yellow flowers that Marcus hadn't seen in months, a piece of his mother's everyday china that had somehow survived decades of family life. James was chewing slowly, deliberately, looking more present than he had in weeks. His eyes were focused on his food rather than staring into the middle distance, and his left hand was steady as he lifted the sandwich to his mouth. The simple act of eating seemed to require his complete attention, but it was attention he was able to give, concentration that had been absent during the forced meals of the past 2 weeks. Denise stood at the sink, washing dishes with the quiet efficiency Marcus remembered from childhood, when the sound of running water and clinking plates had been the soundtrack to afternoon homework sessions and evening conversations about school and friends and plans for the weekend. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't offer explanations or excuses or apologies. She simply said, "He asked for a sandwich. I made it the way he likes it," as if this simple statement explained everything that needed explaining. Marcus wanted to assert his authority, to remind her of professional boundaries and legal liabilities and the complex medical situation they were trying to navigate. But his father had eaten maybe half a dozen full meals in the past month. The sandwich was nearly gone, consumed with the focused determination of someone rediscovering pleasure in something as basic as taste and texture and the satisfaction of hunger being met. "I fired you," Marcus said, not as harshly as he'd intended, but still carrying the weight of authority he wasn't sure he actually possessed anymore. His voice sounded strange in the kitchen, too formal for a room where he'd eaten thousands of meals, where Denise had bandaged his scraped knees and listened to his complaints about geometry homework and congratulated him on college acceptance letters. Denise dried her hands on the dish towel, the same blue and white striped cotton she'd used for years, and looked at him directly with the steady gaze of someone who'd watched him grow from a demanding 4-year-old into a confused young man trying to manage responsibilities that were breaking him. "I know," she said simply, "but he doesn't understand that. He just knows I'm not here anymore, and it's making him scared." She gathered her purse and keys. the same leather handbag she'd carried since Marcus was in middle school, but before leaving she opened the refrigerator and pointed to a container of cut fruit that hadn't been there when he'd left for his meeting. "He'll eat the cantaloupe if you give it to him around 3 o'clock. Not before, not after. 3 o'clock in the blue bowl with the small spoon." Done. The specificity of her instructions carried the weight of years of observation, of paying attention to patterns and preferences that no medical chart would ever capture. Marcus watched her leave, then looked at his father, who was staring at the empty doorway with confusion creeping back into his eyes, like fog rolling in from the coast. The sandwich plate was clean, scraped so thoroughly it barely needed washing, the first meal James had finished in recent memory. At exactly 3 o'clock, Marcus tried the cantaloupe experiment, feeling slightly foolish but desperate enough to trust Denise's precise instructions. His father ate every piece, holding each orange cube up to examine it before placing it carefully in his mouth. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Wednesday, Denise's car was in the driveway again when Marcus returned from a lunch meeting in Midtown that had stretched longer than expected. This time, he didn't confront her immediately, instead watching from his father's bedroom window as she guided James through the garden that had been his pride for 20 years. They moved slowly along the brick paths he'd laid himself during Marcus's junior year of high school, stopping at different plants with the unhurried patience of people who had nowhere else they needed to be. James was nodding at something Denise was saying, sometimes reaching out to touch leaves or flowers with the tentative curiosity of someone rediscovering familiar objects. They spent 20 minutes outside, the longest Marcus had seen his father willingly stay in one place in weeks, and when they came inside, James walked to the kitchen sink without being asked and washed his hands with soap. A routine that had completely disappeared under the other caregivers' more clinical approaches to hygiene and care. Marcus found Denise organizing his father's medications in the kitchen, but not just sorting them by schedule like the certified caregivers had done with military precision. She was arranging them by color and shape in a pattern that seemed random until she explained the logic that came from watching James take pills for years, noting preferences and anxieties that never made it into any medical chart or care plan. "Blue ones first, because he always liked blue," she said, pointing to the morning blood pressure medication that had been giving the other caregivers trouble. "Round ones in this corner, because they're easier for him to see against the white plastic. The big white one goes here by itself, because it scares him when it's mixed with the others." She'd been watching his father take medication for years, noting the small rituals and preferences that made the difference between cooperation and resistance. "You don't have medical training," Marcus said, but the words sounded weak even to him, carrying less conviction than they had the day before when he'd used similar phrases to justify dismissing her. Denise looked up from the pill organizer she was filling with the careful attention of someone arranging flowers, and her expression held 15 years of patient observation. "I have 15 years of James training," she said, using his father's first name with the familiarity of long acquaintance, rather than the professional distance the certified caregivers had maintained. "I know he won't take medicine with orange juice because it reminds him of being sick as a child. I know he needs to hold the water glass with both hands now because his left hand shakes when he's nervous. I know he counts the pills before he takes them every time, and if you interrupt him, he has to start over from the beginning." She was right, and Marcus knew it with the uncomfortable clarity that comes when someone points out obvious truths you've been working hard to ignore. He'd watched 3 professionals try to streamline his father's medication routine, each one growing frustrated when James resisted their efficient methods, their attempts to hurry him through tasks that required patience and ritual, and the acknowledgement that some things couldn't be rushed. But under Denise's patient guidance, he took his evening pills without complaint, following a sequence that honored his need for control over something, anything, in his shrinking world. She didn't try to speed him up or skip steps or explain why her way was better. She simply created space for him to do what he needed to do in the way that felt safe to him. Thursday brought the crisis Marcus had been dreading since the first caregiver quit, the kind of behavioral emergency that had convinced the insurance company his father needed institutional care. James woke up agitated and confused, calling for his wife who died 8 years ago, convinced that strangers were stealing his belongings and moving things around to confuse him. His voice carried through the house with increasing distress, and Marcus felt panic rising in his chest as he remembered similar episodes that had ended with the other caregivers calling for backup, or recommending medication adjustments, or simply giving up. But this time Denise was there, and Marcus listened from the hallway as she spoke to his father in a voice he'd never heard her use before, gentle but confident, acknowledging his fears without trying to reorient him to a reality that felt threatening and unstable. Her tone carried the authority of someone who'd earned the right to be trusted, who'd proven herself through years of consistent presence rather than professional credentials. "I know you're worried about Catherine," she said, referring to Marcus's mother by the name James, still called for in his moments of deepest confusion. "She asked me to take care of things while she's away. She said you might be scared, but I'm here to help until she gets back." It wasn't true in any literal sense, but it worked in ways that medical accuracy had not, giving James something to hold on to in the chaos of his dissolving understanding. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed, and he let Denise guide him to the kitchen for breakfast as if accepting help from someone he trusted rather than resisting invasion from a stranger. She'd learned something the medical professionals hadn't during their brief unsuccessful tenures. Sometimes truth was less important than peace. Sometimes kindness mattered more than accuracy. Marcus confronted her that afternoon, struggling with what he'd witnessed, torn between gratitude for her effectiveness and concern about the implications of managing his father's care through what amounted to therapeutic lies. They stood in the laundry room where she was folding his father's shirts and pants, with the careful attention she'd always shown their household, treating each item as if it belonged to someone who mattered. "You lied to him," Marcus said, though he couldn't manage to put any real accusation into his voice. Denise looked up from the basket of clean clothes, holding one of James's blue button-down shirts, checking for stains or wear spots, with the practiced eye of someone who'd been taking care of other people's things for decades. "I gave him what he needed to feel safe," she corrected gently. "The doctors want to keep telling him his wife is dead, that his memory is wrong, that he's sick. All that does is make him scared and angry every time he forgets and has to learn it again. He can't remember she died, but he can remember feeling afraid." She held the shirt up to check the collar, then folded it with crisp precision. "Your father taught you to be honest, I know that," she continued, "but this disease took his ability to handle certain truths, so I give him the truths he can carry." Marcus watched her work, hands steady and sure, movements efficient, but never rushed. She treated his father's laundry with the same respect she'd always shown everything in their house, as if each item mattered because it belonged to someone who mattered, someone whose dignity was worth preserving even when his understanding was broken. Friday evening, Marcus came home to find his father and Denise in the living room, James sitting at the old piano bench, while she hummed songs from the 1950s that had been popular when his parents were dating. The piano hadn't been opened since his mother's funeral, its lid closed over keys that had once filled their house with music during dinner parties and holiday celebrations and quiet Sunday afternoons when his parents thought he was upstairs doing homework. His father's fingers were moving across the keys, not playing exactly, but finding familiar chords, muscle memory reaching through the fog of disease to touch something that lived deeper than conscious recall. Marcus hadn't heard music in this house in years, had forgotten how the acoustics carried melody into every room, how the sound seemed to make the walls themselves more welcoming. He used to play for Catherine when they were dating, Denise said quietly, not stopping her humming. She told me he'd sit here for hours working out songs to surprise her with. James's fingers found a melody Marcus recognized from childhood, something his parents used to dance to in the kitchen after dinner parties, when they thought he was asleep upstairs, but he was really listening to their laughter and the sound of their feet moving together across the hardwood floor. The music was halting, incomplete, but unmistakably intentional, carried by memories that lived in his hands, even when his mind couldn't access the reasoning behind the notes. Marcus felt something break open in his chest, a grief he'd been carrying since the diagnosis, but had never allowed himself to fully feel. The loss of watching his father disappear while still being physically present. His father wasn't just disappearing into Alzheimer's, wasn't just becoming a collection of symptoms that needed management. Parts of who he'd always been were still there, waiting for someone who knew how to reach them, someone who understood that the disease hadn't erased everything, just made access to memories and abilities more difficult and unpredictable. Denise had been reaching them all along, in ways that had nothing to do with medical training and everything to do with 15 years of paying attention to a man's life. Saturday morning, the insurance assessment coordinator called to confirm Monday's appointment, her voice carrying the professional sympathy of someone who'd delivered similar news to hundreds of families. James would need to demonstrate recognition of family members, ability to follow simple instructions, and evidence of maintaining daily routines. If he failed, the coverage for home care would be terminated immediately, and they'd have 30 days to arrange alternative care arrangements. Marcus hung up the phone feeling sick, his stomach churning with the knowledge that his father barely recognized him on good days, that the structured routines had disappeared weeks ago, replaced by confusion and resistance that grew worse each time someone tried to impose order on his dissolving world. The assessment felt like a formality before an inevitable defeat, a bureaucratic requirement that would officially document what everyone already knew. James Thompson needed more help than home care could provide. He found Denise in the garden with his father, both of them kneeling beside the raised beds where James used to grow tomatoes and peppers with the focused intensity of someone conducting important scientific research. The plants had gone wild over the summer, but Denise was showing him how to prune the overgrowth, guiding his hands to the right stems with the patience of someone teaching a child to tie shoes. "See how this one's yellow?" she said, pointing to a leaf that had turned the color of old newspaper. "That one needs to go, but this green one here, this one's still got life in it." James nodded, following her directions, his movements careful but purposeful, his attention focused in ways that had been missing for months. She handed him the pruning shears, and he held them with familiar confidence, as if his hands remembered this work, even when his mind couldn't recall the reasons behind it. "He built these beds when your mother was pregnant with you," Denise said, not looking at Marcus, but continuing to guide James's hands to the right places. "Spent 3 weekends getting the drainage right, reading books about soil composition from the library. He wanted to grow her the perfect tomatoes." Marcus watched his father work, seeing concentration in his eyes that had been missing for months, watching him respond to instruction and complete tasks with the satisfaction of someone contributing rather than just receiving care. "He remembers this," Denise continued, her voice carrying the authority of long observation. "Not in his mind exactly, but in his hands. His body knows how to do this." Marcus realized he was seeing something the medical professionals had missed entirely during their brief, unsuccessful attempts to manage his father's care. They'd been trying to fix his broken brain, but Denise was working with the parts of him that weren't broken, the muscle memories and emotional associations that had survived the disease's advance. The part that knew how to be gentle with growing things. The part that found comfort in familiar routines. The part that responded to love disguised as ordinary care, to being treated like someone whose contributions mattered rather than someone whose deficits needed management. Sunday afternoon, Marcus made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that solid ground waited somewhere below. He asked Denise to stay for the insurance assessment, not as a caregiver, but as someone who could help James feel safe during the evaluation that would determine whether he could remain in his own home or be moved to institutional care permanently. She agreed, but with conditions that revealed how clearly she understood the stakes and the risks involved for all of them. "If he doesn't recognize you, don't push," she said, her voice carrying the firmness of someone who'd learned hard lessons about what worked and what didn't when dealing with the unpredictable landscape of dementia. "If he gets scared, let me handle it. And if this doesn't work, if they say he has to leave, don't blame yourself. You're doing everything you can." Marcus spent Sunday night going through photo albums again, but this time looking for pictures that might trigger his father's memory in ways that clinical assessments couldn't access. Not recent photos that would highlight how much he'd changed, but ones from 20-30 years ago that might reach the deeper layers of memory that sometimes survived, even when surface recognition failed. Pictures of the garden in full bloom during summers when James had won neighborhood contests for his tomatoes. Pictures of family vacations to Tybee Island, where his father had taught him to body surf in the Atlantic waves. Pictures of James teaching Marcus to use tools in the garage, back when his hands were steady and his instructions were clear and the future seemed manageable. He arranged them on the kitchen table, hoping something would spark recognition when the assessor arrived, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in that his father would have one of his clear moments during the evaluation that would determine the rest of his life. The photos looked strange, spread across the surface where they'd eaten breakfast for 20 years, like artifacts from a civilization that had vanished so gradually no one noticed until it was already gone. Monday morning came grey and humid, typical October weather in Atlanta that made the air feel thick and oppressive even before the sun was fully up. The insurance assessor, Mrs. Rodriguez, arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, with a clipboard, a stopwatch, and an expression of professional sympathy that suggested she'd delivered difficult news to many families in similar situations. She wore a navy blue suit that was both professional and approachable, carrying herself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed people's lives. She explained the process with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd conducted hundreds of these evaluations: 3 simple recognition tests, 2 basic instruction-following tasks, and observation of routine behaviors that demonstrated cognitive function and daily living skills. James needed to pass at least 2/3 of the evaluation to maintain his home care coverage, a threshold that sounded reasonable, until you considered that he sometimes forgot his own name and frequently mistook Marcus for a helpful stranger. Marcus led Mrs. Rodriguez to the living room, where his father sat in his usual chair, staring out the window toward Peachtree Street with the distant expression that had become his default response to confusion he couldn't articulate. Denise was in the kitchen, close enough to help if needed but not intrusive, moving quietly through morning routines that had become second nature over 15 years of family service. Mrs. Rodriguez began with the recognition test, asking James if he knew who Marcus was, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that suggested kindness without patronizing. James looked at his son for a long moment, his eyes searching, but not finding the connection that should have been automatic, that had once been as natural as breathing. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally spoke. "That's the boy," he said finally, his voice carrying uncertain recognition. "Catherine's boy." It wasn't perfect identification, but it was something, a thread of connection that acknowledged relationship even when specific identity remained elusive. Marcus felt his chest tighten with something between relief and heartbreak, grateful for any recognition while mourning the easy familiarity they'd once shared. Mrs. Rodriguez made a note on her clipboard, her expression neutral but not discouraging. Partial recognition, she called it, better than complete failure, but not ideal for someone trying to prove cognitive function adequate for home care. She moved on to basic instructions, asking James to touch his nose, clap his hands, walk to the door. Simple commands that would demonstrate his ability to understand and follow direction. James followed the first two commands without hesitation, his hand finding his nose with accuracy, his claps crisp and deliberate. But the third instruction triggered something that looked like panic, and he stood up, but then sat back down repeatedly, clearly distressed by a command that seemed simple, but felt threatening, in ways Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't understand. His agitation was building, the kind of confused distress that had ended the other caregivers' attempts to work with him. Mrs. Rodriguez was reaching for her pen to mark another failure when Denise appeared in the doorway. Her timing perfect and her approach so natural it didn't feel like intervention. "Mr. James," she said quietly, using the formal address she'd always used with him even after 15 years of familiarity. "Would you like to show this nice lady your tomatoes?" It wasn't the instruction Mrs. Rodriguez had given, but James's face brightened immediately, confusion replaced by something that looked like purpose. He stood without hesitation and walked toward the back door, moving with the focused determination of someone who had somewhere important to be. Mrs. Rodriguez followed, looking confused but intrigued by the transformation in James's demeanor, the way simple reframing had turned resistance into cooperation. In the garden, James became a different person, or rather, he became more like the person he'd always been, underneath the confusion and fear. He showed Mrs. Rodriguez the plants he'd been pruning, explaining in fragmented sentences how to tell which stems were healthy, which ones needed cutting back for the plant's overall health. His words came slowly and sometimes out of order, but his knowledge was evident, his hands moving with confidence among the leaves and branches. Mrs. Rodriguez was making notes rapidly now, documenting behavior that exceeded her expectations for someone at James's stage of cognitive decline. He was following complex instructions, demonstrating memory retention, showing fine motor control and sequential thinking. It wasn't happening in the sterile testing environment she'd expected, but it was happening, revealing abilities that clinical assessment might have missed entirely. When she asked him about his daily routine, Denise guided him through a demonstration that showcased not just his ability to remember sequence, but his capacity to take pride in completing tasks that gave structure to his days. Morning coffee at 7, prepared exactly how he liked it with cream, but no sugar. Medication taken in a specific order, blue pills first because they were easier to see. Breakfast at 8:30, using the plate with yellow flowers because it made food look more appealing. Each step was performed with deliberate care, muscle memory, and emotional comfort working together to create function that looked like normalcy to someone who knew how to see it. James moved through his morning routine with the focused attention of someone participating in ritual rather than just going through motions, each action carrying meaning that went beyond mere task completion. Mrs. Rodriguez spent 2 hours in the house, much longer than the standard assessment required, watching James respond to Denise's prompts with cooperation that surprised everyone except Denise herself. She saw how he relaxed when Denise spoke to him, noticed the way his confusion decreased when she was nearby, observed how routine became possible when it was presented as choice rather than requirement. Finally, she asked to speak with Marcus privately, and they walked out to the front yard beside the mailbox where his father used to wait for the mail carrier every afternoon, back when such simple pleasures still made sense and anticipation could be satisfied by the arrival of bills and catalogues and occasional letters from distant relatives. "This is unusual," Mrs. Rodriguez said, reviewing her notes with the careful attention of someone whose decisions carried significant weight. "Your father's cognitive function is clearly impaired, but his behavioral stability and routine adherence are much better than his file suggested. The woman in there, she's not a certified caregiver, is she?" The question carried no judgment, just professional curiosity about dynamics that didn't fit standard patterns. Marcus shook his head, preparing for the worst, for explanations about liability and regulations and the importance of professional credentials in managing complex medical conditions. She's been with our family for 15 years. She knows him better than anyone. The words came out sounding defensive, but they were also simply true, carrying the weight of observation and experience that couldn't be quantified on assessment forms. Mrs. Rodriguez tapped her pen against her clipboard thoughtfully, the sound rhythmic and somehow comforting in the morning air that was finally starting to warm as the sun climbed higher over the trees that lined Peachtree Street. "I've seen a lot of these cases, Mr. Thompson. Usually by this stage, we're looking at full-time medical supervision, structured environments, pharmaceutical management of behavioral symptoms." She paused, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder that James had installed near the kitchen window 5 years ago, back when his hands were steady enough for small household projects, and his mind was clear enough to remember which birds preferred which types of seed. "But what I'm seeing here is different. Your father is responding to care that's based on relationship rather than protocol. It's not standard, but it's working." The relief hit Marcus like a physical force, making his knees feel weak and his chest tight with gratitude he hadn't expected to feel so intensely. But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't finished, and her next words carried the weight of official requirement wrapped in human understanding. The woman, Denise, she needs to be officially recognized as his primary caregiver. This can't be informal anymore. She approved the home care coverage for another 6 months, with conditions that would formalize what had been working informally and provide oversight for what couldn't be regulated through relationship alone. James needed medical oversight from a visiting nurse twice a week, monthly evaluations with a geriatrician, and a formal care plan that documented his routines and responses for insurance purposes and legal protection. But he could stay home, in the house where he'd raised his family and built memories that were now fading like photographs left in sunlight, in the rooms where his wife's presence still lingered in the arrangement of furniture and the choice of paint colors, in the garden where he could still remember how to tell healthy plants from dying ones, where his hands could still find purpose even when his mind couldn't explain why the work mattered. Marcus walked back into the house, feeling like he was seeing it clearly for the first time in months, noticing details that had become invisible through familiarity and stress and the overwhelming nature of trying to manage someone else's declining life. His father was sitting at the kitchen table with Denise, both of them looking through the photo album Marcus had left out, James pointing at pictures with something that looked like recognition, if not of specific moments, then of emotional content that transcended literal memory. He was pointing at a picture of himself and Catherine on their wedding day, both of them young and serious and impossibly confident about the future they were planning together. James was saying words too quietly for Marcus to hear, but Denise was nodding, responding as if his fragmented sentences made perfect sense, as if the meaning behind his words was more important than their grammatical accuracy. "Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them." That evening, Marcus found himself in the most uncomfortable conversation of his life, sitting across from someone who'd been part of his family for 15 years, but whom he'd never really seen as anything more than reliable household help. They sat in the sunroom where his father spent most afternoons, surrounded by plants that Denise had kept alive and thriving through everything, green proof of consistent care that extended far beyond job descriptions. The late afternoon light filtered through windows that Denise had cleaned countless times, casting golden rectangles across furniture that she'd dusted and arranged and maintained through Marcus's childhood, his teenage years, his college absences, and now his reluctant return to adult responsibilities he'd never wanted and didn't feel prepared to handle. The room felt different now, charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. "I was wrong," Marcus said. the words harder to speak than he'd anticipated, carrying weight that went beyond simple apology into territory that challenged everything he'd believed about competence and authority and the value of different kinds of knowledge. Not just about firing you, about what I thought caring for my father required, about what you've been doing all these years. Denise was quiet, hands folded in her lap, with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to listening rather than speaking, waiting for him to continue without rushing him toward conclusions he might not be ready to reach. Her presence was calming in ways that reminded Marcus of childhood illnesses when she'd brought him soup and sat with him until his fever broke, not because it was her job, but because someone needed to care, and she was there to do it. I saw what I expected to see instead of what was really there, he continued, struggling with honesty that felt exposing and necessary. I thought credentials mattered more than understanding. I thought professional meant better. The admission tasted bitter, carrying the flavor of privilege and assumption and the kind of blindness that comes from never having to look closely at how your life actually works. Marcus pulled out a folder he'd spent all afternoon preparing, working with lawyers and HR specialists and insurance coordinators to create something that had never existed before in their family's employment structure. I want to offer you a position as my father's primary caregiver. Not the maid who also helps with Dad, but his caregiver who happens to have been part of our family for 15 years. The folder contained documents that formalized what felt revolutionary and obvious at the same time. The salary was equivalent to what they would have paid for specialized dementia care, more than 3 times what she'd been making as their housekeeper. The benefits package was comprehensive, including health insurance and vacation time, and a retirement plan that acknowledged this wasn't just a job, but a career that deserved security and recognition. Most importantly, the job description formally recognized everything she'd been doing informally for months, giving her authority to make decisions about James's daily care, to coordinate with medical professionals, to be acknowledged as someone whose expertise mattered in official contexts rather than just family ones. It was a document that attempted to capture in legal language something that had always been more about relationship than regulation. Denise opened the folder, reading through the offer slowly with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to make assumptions about what people meant versus what they said. Her expression revealed nothing, but Marcus could see her processing information that went beyond salary figures and benefit structures into questions about trust and authority and the kind of responsibility that couldn't be easily handed back if things became difficult. "What is it?" Marcus asked, seeing hesitation in her face, despite the generous terms he'd spent hours crafting with professional advisors who specialized in elder care arrangements. He'd expected gratitude, relief, maybe even excitement about recognition that was long overdue. Instead, he saw the caution of someone who understood complexities he was only beginning to recognize. "Your father's not going to get better," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of medical reality that no one else had been willing to state so directly. "This disease, it only goes one direction. There are going to be harder days coming. Days when he doesn't remember how to eat, how to walk, how to recognize anyone at all." She looked out the window toward the garden, where James was visible through the glass, watering plants with the focused concentration of someone performing important work, unaware that his son and caregiver were discussing his future in terms that would have terrified him if he could understand them. "Days when he's scared and angry, and nothing I do will help. Are you prepared for that?" The question hit Marcus with unexpected force, revealing assumptions he hadn't examined about illness, following predictable patterns, about love being enough to manage progressive loss, about good intentions translating automatically into sustainable commitment. "Because once you make this official, once you trust me with this, I need to know you won't change your mind when things get difficult." Marcus thought about the question she was really asking. Would he abandon her when caring for his father became harder than managing a business empire? Would he lose patience when the man who'd taught him everything forgot his name permanently? Would he blame her when love wasn't enough to slow the disease's progression, when all her expertise couldn't prevent the inevitable losses that lay ahead? "I can't promise I'll handle it perfectly," Marcus said, honesty feeling like the only foundation solid enough to build on. "But I can promise I won't make the same mistake twice. I fired you because I thought there was someone better qualified to care for my father. There isn't. There never was." He paused, watching his father through the window as he watered plants with concentration that looked almost like meditation. "You know him in ways I never took time to learn. You see who he still is instead of just what he's lost. I need that. He needs that." The admission felt like stepping into territory he'd avoided for years, acknowledging dependence on someone whose expertise he'd dismissed, whose contributions he'd undervalued, whose presence he'd taken for granted in ways that shamed him now. Denise signed the contract that evening, but not before adding her own condition that revealed how her thinking extended beyond individual care into systemic change that could help other families facing similar challenges. She wanted to train other family caregivers, people like herself who'd been dismissed because they lacked formal credentials, but possessed something more valuable: years of intimate knowledge about the people they cared for. Marcus agreed, not fully understanding what he was committing to, but trusting her judgment in ways he was still learning to trust. Recognizing that her vision extended beyond their immediate situation into broader questions about how society valued different kinds of expertise and who was considered qualified to provide care that mattered most to the people receiving it. The next morning brought the first test of their new arrangement, and it arrived with the kind of confusion that had defeated previous caregivers and sent them fleeing back to more manageable situations. James woke up convinced that Denise was his daughter, not the woman who'd cleaned his house for 15 years. Not his newly official caregiver, but family in the most literal sense. Someone whose presence required no explanation beyond blood and love. Marcus watched from the hallway as she navigated this confusion with the same gentle redirection she'd used for his other delusions, neither correcting nor reinforcing, but simply accepting his reality and working within it to maintain peace and dignity. "That's right," she said. "I'm here to take care of you, just like family does." She didn't insist on accuracy or try to reorient him to facts he couldn't retain. She gave him the emotional truth he needed. Someone who loved him was nearby. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to see his father's care as something more complex than medical management, more nuanced than following protocols designed for average cases rather than individual people with specific histories and preferences and fears. Denise showed him how to read the subtle signs that preceded his father's difficult moments, teaching him to recognize patterns that could help prevent crises rather than just respond to them. The way James's hands would flutter when he was getting overwhelmed by too much stimulation or too many choices at once. The specific kind of stillness that meant he was searching for a word that wouldn't come, struggling with language that had once been effortless, but now required enormous effort for simple communication. The look in his eyes when he was about to ask for his wife, who wouldn't be coming home, but whose absence still surprised him with fresh grief every time he remembered and forgot and remembered again. By Thanksgiving, their new routine had settled into something that felt sustainable, built on understanding rather than forcing James to adapt to caregiving approaches designed for institutional efficiency rather than individual comfort. James had good days and bad days, but the good days were more frequent, and the bad days were less devastating, managed with strategies that honored his dignity while acknowledging his limitations. He'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost during the difficult weeks when eating had become a battle of wills rather than a source of pleasure, and he slept through most nights without the agitation that had once made rest impossible for everyone in the house. He'd even started helping with simple household tasks that gave him a sense of purpose, folding dish towels and sorting mail and arranging flowers from the garden in ways that contributed to family life, rather than just receiving care. When Marcus's sister flew in from London for the holiday, navigating the complexities of international travel and work schedules that had kept her away during the worst of their father's decline, she found James in the kitchen with Denise, making cornbread from their mother's recipe. His hands remembered the measurements, even when his mind couldn't recall the names of ingredients, muscle memory reaching across decades to touch skills that lived deeper than conscious thought. The most remarkable change, though, was in Marcus himself, in ways that surprised him with their depth and persistence. He'd begun staying home more, scheduling fewer evening meetings that stretched into night, finding reasons to be present during his father's daily routines, rather than treating them as medical management that happened while he focused on business responsibilities that suddenly seemed less urgent and less important. He learned that James still remembered how to shuffle cards with the dexterity of someone who'd played poker with friends every Friday night for 20 years, even though he couldn't follow the rules of any card games or remember what the different suits meant. He discovered that his father could still identify birds at the backyard feeder with perfect accuracy, naming cardinals and blue jays and mourning doves while forgetting what he'd eaten for breakfast an hour earlier. These discoveries felt like small miracles, evidence that the person he'd always known was still there underneath the confusion, still accessible to someone who knew how to reach him. They changed Marcus's understanding of what loss meant, what remained valuable when obvious abilities disappeared, what counted as meaningful connection when traditional communication became impossible. 3 months after Denise officially became his father's caregiver, Marcus made an announcement at the company's board meeting that surprised everyone, including himself, revealing how profoundly his thinking had changed about expertise and value and the kinds of problems money could and couldn't solve. He was establishing a family caregiver program, partnering with local agencies to identify and train people like Denise, who had years of experience caring for family members but lacked formal certification. The board members were skeptical, raising concerns that reflected conventional thinking about professional standards and liability management and measurable outcomes. Insurance companies preferred certified professionals with documentation and credentials that could be verified and regulated. Liability concerns were significant when dealing with vulnerable populations and complex medical conditions. The program would cost nearly $2 million annually, with no guarantee of results that could be measured in traditional business terms. But Marcus had learned something about measurable outcomes that didn't show up on medical charts or insurance forms or quarterly reports, results that mattered more to families than statistics that impressed auditors. His father hadn't just stabilized under Denise's care. He'd rediscovered pieces of himself that everyone had assumed were lost forever, abilities and preferences and sources of joy that formal caregiving had overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant to medical management. The program launched in January with 12 family caregivers, most of them women like Denise, who'd been caring for relatives with dementia, disability, or chronic illness for years, without recognition or support from systems designed around professional credentials rather than proven effectiveness. They met twice a week for training sessions that covered medical basics, legal requirements, and documentation procedures required for insurance compliance and family protection. But the heart of the program was peer support, women sharing strategies that no textbook taught because they grew from relationships rather than protocols, from understanding individuals rather than managing categories of illness. How to redirect aggression with humor that acknowledged frustration without taking it personally. How to maintain dignity during intimate care that preserved privacy and choice, even when confusion made cooperation difficult. How to find joy in tiny victories that meant everything to families even when they looked insignificant to outsiders. By spring, word of the program had reached other families dealing with similar challenges, spreading through networks of people who'd been struggling alone with care responsibilities that felt overwhelming and undervalued. Marcus found himself fielding calls from adult children across the Atlanta metro area, desperate for alternatives to institutional care, but afraid to trust family members or long-time employees without medical training who nonetheless understood their relatives in ways that certified professionals couldn't match. The program expanded to include a placement service, matching experienced family caregivers with families who needed their unique combination of skill and understanding, creating opportunities for people whose expertise had been invisible to formal healthcare systems but invaluable to the families who depended on them. It became a bridge between informal care that worked but lacked recognition and formal care that had credentials but often lacked effectiveness. The breakthrough moment came in April, 6 months after Denise had officially taken over his father's care, during an ordinary afternoon that revealed extraordinary preservation of abilities everyone had assumed were gone. Marcus was working in his home office, trying to focus on quarterly reports that demanded attention he couldn't quite manage, when he heard voices from the garden, carrying clearly through windows open to spring air that smelled of dogwood blossoms and fresh mulch. His father was showing Denise's nephew how to plant tomato seedlings, his instructions clear and detailed and completely coherent for the first time in months. His movements were confident, his knowledge intact, his ability to teach preserved in ways that defied everything the doctors had predicted about the progression of his disease. For 20 minutes, James was completely present, completely himself, sharing understanding that had somehow survived everything the disease had taken from him. Marcus stood at the window, watching this ordinary miracle unfold in soil his father had prepared and tended for 20 years, and realized what Denise had been trying to tell him from the beginning. His father wasn't gone, wasn't reduced to a collection of symptoms that needed management. Parts of him were hidden, waiting for someone who knew where to look and how to reach them, for conditions that allowed dormant abilities to surface and flourish. The medical professionals had focused on what James had lost, measuring decline and documenting deficits and planning interventions based on absence rather than presence. But Denise had focused on what remained, building their care plan around his strengths instead of his limitations, his preserved memories instead of his confusion, his dignity instead of his disease, his identity as a whole person rather than his status as a patient. That evening, Marcus called his sister in London to update her on their father's progress, and for the first time since the diagnosis, the news was genuinely good rather than just better than expected. James was maintaining his weight, sleeping well most nights, participating in household routines that gave structure to his days, and having more lucid moments than anyone had dared to hope for at this stage of his illness. The family caregiver program was exceeding expectations in ways that couldn't be captured in statistics, but were evident in stories, testimonials from families who'd found alternatives to institutional care that preserved relationships while providing safety and medical oversight. Several participants were considering careers in professional elder care, inspired by training that honored their existing expertise, while adding formal skills that made them more effective advocates for their clients. Most importantly, their father was still living in the house he'd shared with their mother, surrounded by the memories and routines that gave his days meaning, even when he couldn't articulate why familiar objects and spaces brought him comfort and peace. He was still himself, still recognizable as the man who'd raised them and built a business and loved their mother with devoted consistency, even when disease made that self harder to reach and less predictable in its appearances. "How did you know?" his sister asked, her voice carrying across thousands of miles with gratitude and curiosity in equal measure. How did you know Denise was the right person when all the professionals said he needed institutional care? The question touched on assumptions about expertise and authority and the kinds of knowledge that get valued by systems designed around credentials rather than results. Marcus considered the question, thinking about all the signs he'd missed, all the assumptions he'd made, all the expertise he'd dismissed because it didn't come with certificates and degrees and official recognition from institutions that determined who was qualified to provide care that actually mattered to the people receiving it. "I didn't know," he admitted, honesty feeling like the only response that honored the complexity of what they'd learned and the mistakes that had nearly cost them everything that mattered most. "I almost made the biggest mistake of my life by not seeing what was right in front of me. Denise saved him, but she also saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have been able to live with." He paused, watching through the window as Denise helped his father get ready for bed, a routine they'd perfected over months of patient trial and error, each step choreographed around his preferences and limitations, and the dignity that never changed regardless of what abilities the disease might steal. "She taught me that caring for someone isn't about having all the right qualifications. It's about paying attention to who they really are, even when they can't tell you themselves." 6 months later, the insurance company completed their annual review of James's case, and the results challenged conventional expectations about dementia progression and the effectiveness of different care approaches. His cognitive decline had stabilized rather than accelerated. His behavioral symptoms were well managed without increased medication, and his quality of life scores were higher than anyone had projected based on his initial assessment and diagnosis. Mrs. Rodriguez, the assessor who'd initially approved his home care after witnessing the remarkable demonstration of retained abilities that formal testing had missed, came back to see how he was doing with the curiosity of someone who'd learned to recognize exceptional outcomes in a field where progress was rare and stability was considered success. She found him in the kitchen with Denise, carefully arranging flowers from the garden in a vase with the focused concentration of someone performing important work, his movements deliberate and peaceful and completely absorbed in the task at hand. The scene radiated contentment in ways that contradicted everything she'd expected to find after a year of progressive decline. "This is remarkable," Mrs. Rodriguez told Marcus privately, her professional detachment giving way to genuine amazement at outcomes that exceeded every prediction in James's medical file. "I've been doing these assessments for 8 years, and I've never seen someone at his stage of Alzheimer's maintain this level of function and contentment. What you've created here, this model of care, it should be studied. It should be replicated." She recommended that James's case be used as an example of successful home-based dementia care, a model that prioritized relationship and individual understanding over standardized protocols designed for institutional efficiency rather than personal meaning. The recognition felt good, validation that their approach worked in ways that could be documented and shared with other families facing similar challenges. But Marcus had learned to measure success differently now, in units that couldn't be quantified on assessment forms, but mattered more than any official recognition. Success was his father eating dinner without prompting, taking pleasure in flavors and textures that connected him to decades of shared meals and family traditions that survived even when specific memories faded. Success was the way James's face lit up when he heard Denise's key in the front door each morning. Recognition that went deeper than name or relationship into something that felt like coming home to safety and understanding and unconditional acceptance. Success was the afternoon last week when his father had looked at Marcus and said, "You're my boy," with perfect clarity and unmistakable love that bridged every gap the disease had created between them. These weren't medical miracles that could be replicated in clinical settings or taught in professional training programs. They were human miracles, built one small moment of understanding at a time, constructed from patience and attention, and the kind of love that showed up in ordinary actions repeated with extraordinary consistency over months and years of gradual change. A year after firing Denise and nearly losing his father to institutional care that would have provided safety without meaning, Marcus stood in their kitchen on a Sunday morning, watching her teach James how to make pancakes from scratch, with ingredients that filled the room with smells, that reached back to childhood breakfasts and holiday mornings and the simple abundance of being cared for by people who knew your preferences and honored your dignity. His father's movements were slower now, his confusion more frequent, but his engagement was real and sustained in ways that defied medical predictions about inevitable decline and progressive loss of ability. He was measuring flour with the concentration of a scientist conducting important research, following Denise's gentle guidance with pride in his contribution to their breakfast that went beyond accomplishing tasks into participating in family life that valued his presence rather than just managing his limitations. Marcus realized that this scene, ordinary as it looked to anyone walking past their window, represented everything he'd almost thrown away in his rush to find professional solutions to personal problems that required understanding more than credentials, relationship more than regulation, love more than management techniques designed for efficiency rather than meaning. His father wasn't just being cared for in ways that met medical standards and satisfied insurance requirements. He was still living, still contributing, still connected to the people and routines that defined him as more than his disease, more than the sum of his symptoms, more than a care recipient who needed professional management of his declining abilities. Denise had saved more than James's life during those critical weeks when institutional care had seemed inevitable and irreversible. She'd saved his dignity, his identity, and his place in the family that loved him, not despite his limitations, but including them, seeing him as whole even when parts of him had become inaccessible to conventional approaches that focused on deficits rather than preservation. The pancakes were slightly lumpy, a little too thick, definitely not perfect by any culinary standard that valued technical achievement over personal satisfaction. James ate them with enormous pleasure, syrup dripping down his chin as he savored each bite with the focus of someone rediscovering simple joys that had seemed lost forever, completely present in the moment, without worrying about past or future. Denise wiped his face with the same gentle attention she'd shown him for 15 years, treating him with the respect due a man who'd built a business empire and raised a family, and loved his wife with devotion that survived even when memory of her face sometimes faded, not a patient who needed managing, but a person whose worth transcended his current abilities. If this gave you hope today, subscribe. We're building a small corner of the internet for that. Marcus learned something that morning about the difference between caring and truly caring for someone, distinctions that went beyond professional terminology into territory that could only be understood through experience rather than training. Caring meant meeting basic needs, keeping people safe, following proper procedures that protected against liability and satisfied regulatory requirements designed for institutional settings rather than individual relationships. Caring for someone meant seeing them as whole people, honoring who they'd always been while accepting who they were becoming, finding ways to reach the parts of them that remained vibrant and alive even when obvious abilities had disappeared or become unreliable. It meant recognizing that love expressed through ordinary moments could be more healing than any medical intervention, more effective than protocols designed by experts who'd never lived with the daily reality of progressive loss. 2 years later, the Family Caregiver Program had grown into a non-profit organization, serving families throughout the Southeast, with satellite programs in 12 states and training curricula that were being studied by universities interested in alternative approaches to elder care that prioritized relationships over credentials without abandoning professional standards or medical oversight. Denise had become its director, balancing administrative responsibilities with direct care that kept her grounded in the daily realities of family caregiving, training hundreds of family caregivers while continuing to care for James 3 days a week with the same attention and expertise that had saved his life and transformed Marcus's understanding of what expertise actually meant. Marcus had stepped back from daily business operations to spend more time at home, discovering that his father's best hours were often in the late afternoon when the light in the garden was soft and his memories seemed closest to the surface, when stories from his childhood or early marriage would emerge with startling clarity before fading again into the mist of confusion that characterized most of his days. James still lived in the house on Peachtree Street, still tended his tomato plants each summer with help that allowed him to maintain the illusion of independence while ensuring his safety, still remembered how to make his wife's favorite cornbread recipe when Thanksgiving came around, and muscle memory guided his hands through measurements and mixing that his mind couldn't consciously recall. He forgot Marcus's name more often than he remembered it, sometimes looking at his son with polite confusion that broke Marcus's heart every time it happened. But he never forgot the feeling of being loved, being valued, being treated like the accomplished man he'd always been, rather than the diminished version of himself that disease had created. Denise made sure of that, one ordinary day at a time, with consistency that provided security even when nothing else in James's world felt predictable or safe. Her presence was the anchor that allowed him to navigate confusion without panic, limitation without despair, progressive loss without losing the essential dignity that made his life worth living. The last conversation Marcus could remember having with his father, as the sharp-minded businessman he'd once been, happened 3 years after Denise became his official caregiver, during one of those unexpected moments of clarity that came without warning and disappeared just as suddenly, leaving behind gratitude for whatever had made brief connection possible. They were sitting in the garden on a warm October afternoon, watching the sun set through trees they'd planted together when Marcus was still in high school, and his father's hands were steady enough for digging holes, and his mind was clear enough to plan for seasons that lay months in the future, when anticipation was possible and hope felt reasonable. James turned to his son with sudden clarity that cut through months of confusion, like sunlight breaking through clouds, and said, "You did the right thing, keeping Denise here. She understands what matters." His voice carried the authority Marcus remembered from childhood, when his father's opinions had seemed unquestionable and his guidance had felt like solid ground in an uncertain world. Marcus held his father's hand, feeling the strength that remained in those fingers, despite everything the disease had taken, despite tremors and confusion, and the gradual erosion of abilities that had once seemed permanent and reliable. "What matters, Dad?" he asked, though he thought he already knew the answer from months of watching Denise demonstrate it through actions rather than words. James smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that had become increasingly rare but no less precious when it happened, carrying traces of the man who'd taught Marcus to drive and to tie his shoes and to shake hands with confidence. "Being known," he said simply, words that contained entire philosophies about human dignity and the importance of recognition that went beyond professional assessment of abilities and limitations. "Being seen for who you really are, not just what you can't do anymore." It was the last complete sentence James ever spoke to him, but it contained everything Marcus needed to understand about the gift Denise had given their family, about the difference between managing someone's decline and honoring their humanity throughout whatever changes might come. She'd seen his father clearly when everyone else, including Marcus himself, had focused only on his limitations, his failures to meet normal expectations, his inability to function according to standards designed for people whose minds worked in predictable ways. She'd treated him like James Thompson, successful businessman and loving father, who happened to have Alzheimer's, instead of an Alzheimer's patient who used to be someone important but now required professional management of his inevitable decline. Marcus kept that conversation close to his heart as his father's condition gradually worsened over the following months. As the good days became less frequent and the confusion more persistent, as language became increasingly difficult and recognition more sporadic, and the man he'd always known seemed to slip further away from reach. But even in his final months, when James could no longer speak clearly or recognize familiar faces consistently, when the disease had claimed most of what had made conversation possible, something essential remained that Denise continued to honor and protect and celebrate through the smallest gestures of respect and affection. He still smiled when he heard music from the 1950s, songs that had been popular when he was courting the woman who became Marcus's mother, melodies that reached parts of his brain that disease couldn't touch, and memories that lived in harmony rather than words. He still reached for Denise's hand when she sat beside him, recognizing safety and comfort even when he couldn't name the person who provided it. He still found peace in the garden that had given him joy for decades, sitting among plants he'd chosen and tended with the satisfaction of someone whose work had created beauty that outlasted the ability to remember why beauty mattered, surrounded by growth that continued even when understanding stopped. When James passed away quietly in his sleep on a spring morning, surrounded by the people who loved him in the house that had been his home for 40 years, Marcus felt grief, but also profound gratitude that went beyond simple appreciation into recognition of gifts that couldn't be measured or repaid or adequately acknowledged. His father had lived with dignity until the end, cared for by someone who saw his worth even when he couldn't express it himself, someone who had treated his confusion with patience and his limitations with respect and his remaining abilities with celebration rather than surprise. Denise had given them something no amount of money could have purchased, the gift of allowing James to remain himself, recognizably and completely, even as Alzheimer's tried to erase everything that had made him who he was. At the memorial service, colleagues from the business world spoke about James's professional achievements, his integrity in dealing with competitors and employees, his vision for the company that now employed thousands of people across 3 states and had survived transitions that might have destroyed less solid foundations. But Marcus's eulogy focused on a different kind of success, accomplishments that couldn't be measured in dollars or market share or quarterly reports, but mattered more than any business achievement could ever matter to the people who had loved James Thompson as a person rather than respecting him as a professional. He talked about a man who'd taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in relationships, that real strength came from vulnerability rather than control, and that the most important business he'd ever run was the business of loving people well, of seeing them clearly and treating them with dignity and creating conditions where they could flourish even when circumstances made flourishing seem impossible. He ended by thanking Denise publicly, not just for caring for his father, but for teaching him what caring actually meant, for showing him that expertise came in many forms, and that credentials were less important than character, that sometimes the most qualified person for a job was the one who'd been doing it quietly, competently, and lovingly for years without recognition or official acknowledgement. She'd shown him that the most revolutionary act was often the simplest one, paying attention to people, really seeing them for who they were, honoring their dignity even when their abilities changed, and trusting that love expressed through ordinary care could accomplish what no amount of professional intervention could achieve. The Family Caregiver Program continues to thrive, now serving families in 12 states and training more than 1,000 family caregivers annually, operating on the principle Denise demonstrated in their own home, that the best care grows from understanding rather than training, from relationship rather than protocol, from seeing people as individuals rather than collections of symptoms to be managed according to standardized procedures. Marcus still lives in the house on Peachtree Street, maintaining the garden his father loved with the same attention to detail and seasonal rhythms that had given James such satisfaction, keeping the routines that had made their final years together meaningful rather than just medically managed, honoring memory through continued presence in spaces that held decades of family history. He learned something from watching Denise care for his father that changed how he approached every relationship in his life, every business decision that affected real people, every assumption about value and expertise, and the kinds of knowledge that actually matter when human dignity is at stake. That paying attention to people, really seeing them for who they are rather than what they can or cannot do, is both the simplest and most profound gift we can offer each other, requiring no special training but infinite patience, no credentials but consistent presence, no professional recognition but personal commitment to honoring the humanity that remains constant even when everything else changes. In a world that often values efficiency over empathy, credentials over character, measurable outcomes over meaningful relationships, Marcus discovered that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply recognizing the expertise that exists in unexpected places, honoring the wisdom that comes from years of quiet service, and trusting that love expressed through ordinary care can accomplish what no amount of professional intervention can achieve. The blue plate with tiny yellow flowers still sits in the kitchen cabinet, along with the other small objects that meant everything to a man whose memory was fading, but whose need to feel valued never diminished. They remind Marcus daily of the lesson Denise taught him, that caring for someone means honoring not just their needs, but their dignity, their history, and their irreplaceable place in the hearts of those who love them. Every morning, when he makes coffee in the same blue mug his father preferred, Marcus remembers that expertise comes in forms that can't be credentialed or regulated or replicated in clinical settings. It lives in the accumulation of small observations made over years of consistent presence, in the patience to see patterns that emerge slowly over time, in the wisdom to know when to push and when to yield and when to simply bear witness to someone's journey through changes that can't be controlled or reversed. The garden still blooms each spring with flowers James planted and vegetables he chose, tended now by hands that learned their gentleness from watching Denise work with someone whose confusion made every interaction unpredictable, but whose humanity remained constant underneath the surface changes that disease had wrought. In quiet moments, Marcus sometimes hears his father's voice in the kitchen, not as hallucination but as memory, so vivid it feels like presence, saying the words that changed everything about how he understood care and competence and the kinds of knowledge that actually matter when someone's dignity hangs in the balance. Being known, James had said, being seen for who you really are. It was a lesson that came too late to prevent mistakes, but early enough to make redemption possible, a gift that transformed loss into understanding and regret into wisdom that could be shared with other families facing similar crossroads between institutional efficiency and personal meaning. The Family Caregiver Program continues to grow, but its success is measured not in numbers served or dollars saved or professional recognition received. It's measured in stories like theirs, in families who discovered that sometimes the person best qualified to provide care is the one who's been quietly doing it all along, waiting to be seen and trusted and given the authority to use knowledge that comes from love rather than training. Marcus learned that the most important business decision he ever made wasn't about quarterly profits or market expansion or strategic positioning for competitive advantage. It was about recognizing that Denise Rodriguez, who'd been part of their family for 15 years, who knew his father's preferences and fears and sources of joy better than any certified professional ever could, deserved the chance to prove that expertise comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most qualified person for a job is the one who's been doing it with quiet competence while waiting for someone to notice that competence deserves recognition. The house on Peachtree Street stands as monument to second chances and the possibility of learning to see clearly, even when privilege and assumption have clouded vision for years. It's a place where love learned to express itself through ordinary actions performed with extraordinary consistency, where dignity was preserved through the smallest gestures of respect, where expertise was honored regardless of its source. And in the end, that's what mattered most, not the credentials on the wall or the protocols in the manual or the professional opinions of people who'd never lived with the daily reality of loving someone through progressive loss. What mattered was seeing James Thompson clearly, honoring who he remained even when disease changed what he could do, and creating conditions where his humanity could flourish until his final breath. That's the legacy Denise gave them all, the gift that transformed tragedy into grace and taught them that sometimes the most important expertise is simply knowing how to love someone well, no matter what changes might come. No matter what abilities might be lost, no matter what the world might say about who's qualified to provide the care that actually matters.